My name is Michael Wood. Since the age of 17, I've been willing to die in service to my community. In the U.S. Marine Corps, I was Sergeant Wood.
Michael Wood spent 11 years in the Baltimore Police Department.
Michael Wood is a very honest individual. He was not liked by the Baltimore City Police because he didn't play the good old boy network game.
As my career developed, I set out to understand why people offend, instead of how they offend.
The reason why these consent decrees don't do anything is because there's no enforcement or changing of the mechanism of incentives for the officers. So all you're doing is talking about it.
I certainly was going to cross. I was ready to shoot if I had to, but I was never going to cross that line.
But you kind of wanted to shoot.
Sure. Get what you inspect, not what you expect.
So, or anywhere that's populated, is your metric is based off of arrest. So you don't actually go out and engage with the community, because that would be time that you could be getting the arrest that you're expected to get to prove that you're a decent officer. So you actually don't have any incentive to communicate.
Michael, we should be looking for goals to not have people end up in the criminal justice system. Instead, every solution we have is to push them into the criminal justice system.
It should not be up to Jeff Sessions to determine how Baltimore Police Department operates. It should be up to the residents of Baltimore. Jeff Sessions doesn't know anything about policing, never has and never will.
I want to read a quote that you gave the Washington Post, which struck me. You said, "When you work in policing, you're inundated early on with the us versus them mentality. It's ingrained in you that this is a war, and if someone isn't wearing a uniform, they're the enemy. It just becomes part of who you are, of how you do your job."
What I'm trying to say is that we are looking at people who are doing nothing new, and if we focus on the actions, then we can fix the things for next time. Because when you focus on people, we end up thinking we can chop the head off, they put a new person in and something will change. But if we don't focus on the methodologies and the institutions, then we will be
put them in a prison cell, do the paperwork, go back out and do it again. So what we really need is to change the incentives and disincentives so that no matter what the role, we're still going towards that objective that actually serves.
More occupation, more vehicles, if your answer continues to be violent, because we have to understand that everything about policing is inherently violent. I have come in there with authority and told you what you will do.
It was like 30-something minutes. That's all right.
This whole fucking situation with our narratives in this country are driving me insane. I feel like it's back in the day when, like, the police would do something to a true shithead.
Sure.
And it was like, why are you making me defend this shithead? Why? And it's in these narratives that we're having, I mean, heads of the Department of Justice are making claims where we have to go, why are you making me defend him?
Yeah.
Why? Why do I have to spend half of my day defending Trump's actions? Because you can't put them in proper, realistic context.
No, I mean, that is a frustrating thing. But
the last thing I want to do is fucking defend something Trump does.
Yeah. I know. I think the challenge we both face in our work is trying to get people to talk about the thing that's actually happening, as opposed to repeat the phrases they think they're supposed to repeat when certain things happen. You know, I think that our politics is so much more theological than people realize, right? There's a lot of phrases we say, but they're really just kind of confessional statements. They're not real analyses of the problem or of the legal situation or of the legal anything. And frankly, most of the people who are making the statements aren't qualified to talk about those things because they just don't know anything about them. They're not professionals in those realms, or they don't have educational backgrounds in those realms. And so what you're left with is a sort of series of confessional statements, and the right has their confessional statements, and we have our confessional statements, and theirs are about guns and immigrants and this and that, and ours are about $15 minimum wages and whatever. But they're all sort of equally divorced from reality and the question, but we continue to pretend that these are the relevant lines in the battlefield. And, things just, which is why we're just always fighting, because we're fighting about who is the true God. We're not fighting about the facts or the problem or how we might best address it. This is really entirely about our broader worldview about what is right and wrong being validated. So this is really just a religious argument we're having.
Wait a minute, Roberto. Are you telling me that President Trump is not an illegitimate president?
It turns out when you win the Electoral College in an election, you are a legitimate president. It doesn't matter that you offend me. Legitimacy is strictly tied to the question of law and not the question of anybody's feelings.
Okay. I don't know. I think a lot of people have been telling me otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you're saying that there's some greater moral law or order that Trump's election violates, that's fine, but you're making a religious argument. And if I'm not a member of your church, I'm just not going to care. Even if I'm like a member of the same side of your politics, right? Like we might both be on the left, but I don't go to your church. So I don't know when people start saying like, he's illegitimate. Like, what do you mean? Like under like moral law? Because that's not a real thing.
I don't think they know what they mean.
No, I don't. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it's like when you get the nouveau atheists who are like, we believe in rationality. It's like, really? Because rationality is a theological concept. It's the faculty of the soul that allows you to know God. So all you've done is replace God with truth or science, but it's the same narrative, right?
Have you seen my issues with any of the atheist community? Like, I've been even going on some more atheist stuff where I think they even focus on this idea of being a skeptic. And being skeptical is the wrong idea. You have to be critical. So if you're just skeptical, it just means you just shit on everything. So which they're good. So they shit on everything that isn't their preconceived idea.
No, exactly.
That's a religion.
It's hard not to. It's hard not to conclude when you're speaking to these folks that they're not a member of a religion. Because we can just begin. We could just begin. Yeah, right. I mean, so let's actually let's talk about the religion of policing for a bit, because I did want to. We've now had 3 separate body camera videos, not necessarily come out publicly, but we've heard reported that in Baltimore 3 separate times a body camera video has suggested impropriety by an officer. It's possible that in a genius moment, these officers decided to recreate a legal search and seizure of contraband, but the way the footage looks, it looks like they just planted it. And now, and I can't quite get a good estimate from the existing reporting. It's somewhere after the first 2 videos were reported on, it said that 43 cases, I believed, had been dropped by the state's attorney's office in Baltimore as a result of the officers being tainted by this incident, by these incidents and by these videos being revealed, because those officers, their testimony was going to be relied on in trial, so they couldn't do that anymore. And then there was like an additional 40-something that had to be dropped, it seemed, as a result of the 3rd video. Though I can't quite tell if that's just the same 40 number being cited multiple times, but the way the reporting laid it out, it seemed to suggest that at this point, about 84 cases have been dropped, with hundreds of others under review as a result of this. And I couldn't help but sort of think back to the testimony in the Porter trial, where the prosecutor would have a police officer on the stand and they'd be like, "Are you familiar with these?" And they'd be like, "Yeah, those are the general orders." And "Are you familiar with the general order where it says this?" They'd be like, "Yeah, general order says a lot of things. Like, that's not really what, nobody follows that." And it was just like person after person kind of saying like, these things don't matter. This is what we do and this is what we're taught to do. And we've had that conversation how like, you can put in new orders and nothing changes on the street. And like the command structure is actually pretty divorced from what happens on the street in terms of their actual authority to change things. And nonetheless, when we have these discussions about reform, or when we have an incident in which we feel like a citizen has been abused or worse by the police are always right? There's never a moment where like the mountain of evidence about how they don't do their job properly, how they're not even following the regulations that establish their authority to act, right? They're always right. So there's always this sort of religious element to police defense. And like you said, we are in an adversarial system, so we have to expect some of that. But in light of policing kind of becoming this religion, is there any way to, from within, reform the system? Because it seems to me like in Baltimore, we're kind of at the point where the only real option is to disband the department and start fresh. I don't see how a department where professionalism doesn't seem to matter, nobody seems to follow the general orders as a matter of course, and where officers are being routinely caught up in these scandals, it just suggests that they all operate on their own rules, and I don't see how you change that from within, especially when you have this religious aspect to policing is always right.
Well, I think we're getting back to some of our misalignments that are like the fundamental premise of why I believe in civilian-led policing as being the solution.
Sure.
And when you say that the general orders aren't followed, of course, you're absolutely right. But we then have to say, why aren't the general orders followed? And so one of the reasons I could tell you is some of these general orders are decades behind. So there will be a general order written in 1972 talking about collection of physical evidence at the scene that has no idea of wouldn't even talk about collecting blood swabs because they wouldn't know what a DNA test was. That's literally how bad some of the old rules are.
Wow.
So some people being professional will be like, no, man, don't listen to any of that stuff. We have to do this, and we'll even be pushing things to a more professional guideline by ignoring the general orders. But of course, that sets a standard where you're not actually following the orders and you're only following individuals, which remains another problem. You have to be following the system, not any individuals who are adequately manipulating the system so that it actually works. Another reason general orders aren't followed at all is because the actual metrics and incentives for officers are not to follow the general orders. They remain to get the arrest and all those other quotas. So what happens is those who do not play within the game and good old boy network of how the system is literally incentivized and what it literally serves, not in concept, those people will go about their day. They'll do the reality of policing and those actual incentives. And then when they piss off command will go back to the general orders and say, no, you did this wrong, so therefore now you don't get to be promoted, you don't get to ascend in this agency.
That would be pretty shitty to have the general orders used against you. Though this kind of goes back to the conversation we had in the last episode where that's kind of like the issue of equal protection, right? Like when the law isn't applied equally and then it just becomes a bludgeon for one group to use against the other. So in this case, in the policing context, is command against the officers or, the lower level staff. Right? Like it's hard.
That's pretty much all they are.
No, exactly.
General rules are a weapon of command to punish subordinates and pawns that they don't like.
Right. And that can never have legitimacy in the eyes of the people against whom it is used. Right. Which it sounds like, based on this, because every organization is structured like this. Right. There's less command than people being commanded. That's kind of how these things work. And so the majority of the people in the system immediately and necessarily view the supposed thing upon which their authority is based is illegitimate, right? In the same way that when a Sheriff Joe can arbitrarily apply laws against certain groups while not doing it to others, right? Then all the law sort of becomes illegitimate in the eyes of those groups. And so Latinos or other persons of color feel like all of this is just a racist system, right? And like, right, where there are some laws that you probably don't object to, right? Like the laws that guarantee our milk doesn't poison us, right? You don't necessarily read those, but like the entire law becomes illegitimized when equal protection falls apart in this way, and when it just, as a result, inevitably becomes a tool of one group that can be used as a bludgeon against another.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that is the system that we're looking at when it comes to these reforms. So your question was, can a place like Baltimore, who has all of these instances of corruption, be reformed? And I'm still going to continue to say yes, because the people corrupting it are these individuals who are ruining these institutions and ruining their legitimacy, like you were saying. So in Baltimore, who's controlling these things? We have an article by Justin Fenton that just came out talking about the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, and the police commissioner, Kevin Davis, on how to fix Baltimore's crime woes. And the thing is they believe this. They think they can fix Baltimore's crime woes, or that they're in some kind of special ability to do this in authority.
And let me just say, I want you to continue, but let me just say, right, like we're essentially, Kevin Davis hasn't been there quite as long, but at this point he's like a couple years in. And the state's attorney has been there since she was elected in 2014, which is to say that, like, certainly the state's attorney has been in that office in the 3 consecutive years where, you know, Baltimore has seen some historic crime numbers. And he has been commissioner since July of 2015. So, I mean, really not that much less time than S.A. Mosby has been in her office. And so we're essentially asking the 2 people who have overseen like one of the worst jumps in crime in Baltimore history what the solution is.
Right. And you're talking about the people who set some of these standards, because we have a long history of crime in our country and in Baltimore. But these national trend lines have been going down for a very long time. Baltimore is standing out strikingly as a city that is not following the national trend lines and is getting dramatically worse. And it's only a hypothesis, but I think you are right in that how can we see a city like Baltimore have respect for the rule of law when they just witnessed what happened with Freddie Gray and Tyrone West and Abdul Salam, and case after case after case. So why the city's legitimacy of policing is breaking down before a lot of these other places are. And this is another one of those inevitable things that we know will happen when you rip down the fabric of society and make policing illegitimate, because their power truly comes from the people. So if the people don't believe in the policing becomes illegitimate. When you see a city that is rising to 300 killings for the 3rd consecutive year, that is completely bucking the national trends, it is not a joke when I say to you that Kevin Davis is the most ineffective, inept police leader in the history of this country. Never have we seen trends be reversed and the legitimacy of policing broken down like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe a question of to what extent did the police have legitimacy even before Davis arrived, because I do think a lot of this, I mean, frankly, some of these issues in policing have existed as long as policing has.
And they didn't know. People didn't know.
No, I understand. And so that in and of itself, right, is part of the challenge, because I do feel like the whole people didn't know is kind of true. People in power didn't know, and people in sort of dominant groups and classes and social locations didn't know, but right, like when Michelle Alexander's book came out, my reaction was like, yeah, that's kind of like what blacks and Puerto Ricans have been saying for like the last 20 years, as far as I can remember, right? It's not that nobody knows, it's that the people in power don't feel like the voices of the persons who are experiencing these oppressions are legitimate, and so they just get ignored.
I don't know. I don't think they know about police legitimacy. I know that sounds crazy to say, but I don't think most police commissioners understand what it takes to build police legitimacy. I don't think they know the history of policing. You're absolutely right.
And that's true. I mean, I think that's the same. It's the same issue of when people say like, you know, Trump is an illegitimate president because there's like some higher moral standard, and they're not actually religious people, right? Like they're atheists who claim that the president is illegitimate, and so they don't realize like you're referring to a theological and a moral concept when you say like there's a higher law beyond human law that governs actions ultimately, and that we measure human laws by, right? Like that's a very classical Christian position. And it's just that in our history, we've been conditioned to think about these things, right? Like the arc of history bends towards justice, right? But of course, the person who made that statement was a Christian minister, right? So he very explicitly believed in a higher moral authority and law that we can measure human law against, right? And that we can make a determination of human law as unjust on the basis of that measurement. But when other people are doing that and they don't actually subscribe to Christian theology or any theology, right? It's the same thing where like they think they're saying something objective, where they're saying something utterly constructive, but because we don't learn about the history of our ideas, they don't realize what they're saying. And so it looks good on a fucking poster, but
like as you're saying this from Kevin Davis, and he says there was a price to pay for the drop below 200 homicides. The price manifested itself in April and May of 2015, referring to the death of Freddie Gray. I think the long view is that doing it the right way is doing it the hard way. I think most Baltimoreans realize that the way forward is not going to be easy. So let's break this down. There was a price to pay. What price was paid, Kevin Davis, for the drop below 200 homicides? Are you admitting that if you are a totalitarian regime and you use mass incarceration to lock people up, that you can get a temporary reprieve from homicides? Are you saying that that's what your predecessors did? Are you going to put this on record? What are you saying there, law enforcement leader?
No, I mean, I think he's 100% right. I mean, I will say this. I appreciate his willingness to at least indict zero tolerance and its legacy in Baltimore, because other police leaders, even if they'll sort of like criticize zero tolerance, they haven't generally even gone as far as this. But this is kind of like the problem, is that when somebody makes a rather obvious statement in the police command structure, we feel like super relieved, like, somebody just pulled a boulder off our chest. And it seems to me that the people enforcing our laws should have a generally clear-eyed view of the historical and current situation, right? We shouldn't feel relieved when somebody says something like that is obvious on its face.
Totally agree. But I would like to have him expand upon that a little bit more. You know that I would love to be able to ask this dude questions.
Yeah, I mean, my big question is the premise of his statement is still that police are the solution, right? And that's the one part that he hasn't seemed to be able to deconstruct. So it's like, okay, so you've reached the point where you realize police made it worse, and nobody's arguing whether police have the capacity to make these issues worse. But more than maybe still a few of us, but a few of us at least are asking whether the police are really a solution at all. And it doesn't help that, the way criminal justice has been structured historically, it hasn't really been a science. And so like it's afflicted with that circular logic problem. It already knows the conclusion. The conclusion is always more police. And so everything that it produces in terms of its knowledge base leads you back to that answer, because the answer is known from the beginning. And so that everything that is done in terms of method or analysis is designed to get us back to that answer. And it's like you said, like doing serious lead abatement in Baltimore might have greater yields than anything else we can do. But I'm pretty sure Kevin Davis is not going to push a lead abatement plan anytime soon.
Right, which is why I want to dig on what these ideas are, because his next sentence is I think the long view is that doing it the right way is doing it the hard way. So you were talking about colloquialisms. We like to mistake this idea for hard work as being productive work. That's certainly the wrong way of thinking about it. But like you just mentioned there, the long view would be the hard way. What is hard about having and pushing lead abatement? Like, that's not difficult at all, especially for police, because all I have to do is be a bully pulpit for someone else to do the work.
Yeah.
And that most Baltimoreans realize the way forward is not going to go easy. Most Baltimoreans don't know the way forward, and they are going to think that it's always going to be difficult, because people in leadership positions like his seem to continue to do all the wrong things and make it much more difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of the problem is the broader societal inability to realize that this person is not actually an expert on what they're talking about, right? Like Kevin Davis, having had a career in the police, doesn't actually make him an expert in how to reduce crime in Baltimore, for example, right? The two are frankly rather indifferent phenomena to each other. But
one of my biggest frustrations, right, Roberto?
Yeah.
People want to listen to me about policing because I was a cop, and I'm like, guys, that informs my perspective, but it has fuck all to do with me understanding this management system.
And you're absolutely right. And so this goes back to a few episodes ago. You know, we kind of debated whether police or society have to lead on reform, because I think the problem is in a democratic system, as long as our members of our society are still, frankly, dumb enough to be convinced that these persons are experts when that's just not their experience, hasn't set them up for that, right? Like Kevin Davis spent his career as a police officer on the streets, not as a scientist studying crime, its impacts, its drivers and how they might be ameliorated, which policies have and haven't worked, right? Like that's not what he has spent his career doing. He has spent his career implementing essentially the ideas of other people. And then we go, you're an expert on reducing crime. It's like, and so as long as that's the case, as long as society and society's members agree that on that basis, so-and-so is an expert and we're going to continue to listen to this person, I don't see how we get out of this, because we're always just going to end up in the same place where we do whatever police say, and police say policing is the answer.
I don't want you to breeze past that point that you just made. I think it's quite significant that your police leaders and the people we consider to be experts are really just doing the orders of the person before them.
Yeah.
And those people are just doing the orders of the people before them. And then we're like, well, how do we have these completely racist concepts and ideas that people developed hundreds of years ago when they were all racist? Of course.
No, of course. And that's exactly, and I mean, you raised the example of Bielefeld, who was a former Baltimore police commissioner, and his educational background was only as far as a GED, right? And so even if you felt like Bielefeld was relying on the best information produced by the field of criminology, and you felt like criminology was something other than a pseudoscience, you would have to still acknowledge that Bielefeld, having only risen to the level of someone with a high school equivalency, isn't himself in a position to vet the recommendations being handed down from persons who presumably have higher degrees and are the persons who within the discipline of criminology develop the supposed knowledge that then these persons are implementing. So we have a situation where like the person who's maybe sitting in a academic office somewhere and writing a paper that eventually makes its way into a policy on the street, the person most responsible for overseeing that policy isn't in a position from their own educational and professional background to vet the claims and knowledge. And when that's the case, all they can do is follow what this says. I guess this person's an expert. Because they're not qualified. They don't have the frame of reference for being able to vet the information, being able to vet the method, right? Like there's a reason we don't let undergrads teach the same courses that you would require a PhD person to teach.
You're such a liberal elitist. It's so annoying, Roberto.
Yeah, I know. I get that. But as much as Twitter has convinced us of otherwise, our having an opinion about something is not the same as our having knowledge about something. And it takes years and decades of education to get to a point where you actually understand the knowledge production processes of discipline, whether that's, my studies in religion and theology or law, or whether it's, your studies in police management, right? It's taken a lot of time for you to get to that point. And the more educated you get, the more you realize like, yeah, I know a lot at this point, but there's a lot that I don't know, right? Like, you can't know, it's difficult to know the entire history of human thought about a specific issue, right? That's a lot of people over a long period of time thinking about something. And so, when you have this level of education that we are privileged to have, you also realize how much you don't know beyond just like what you're an expert and what you're actually sort of qualified to speak about. But in the case of Bielefeld, he has no frame of reference that allows him to know what he does and doesn't know relative the information he's receiving from, say, the Police Executive Research Forum.
Yeah, I definitely think he means well too.
Yeah,
I think
and
a
that's
lot of
it.
these guys mean well.
I mean, I think a lot of the activists mean well when they say like the minimum wage has to be $15, but they're utterly incapable of doing an economic analysis to know whether that would make sense in their particular locality.
Yeah, and I'll say that the general studies on that say that they are right, but it's incredibly important to know why you're right, not just that you're right.
But there's also some recent information on places that have implemented that policy specifically that suggests it doesn't have the effects that the left assumes.
Oh no, because I mean, well, of course there's nuance. If there's some town in Iowa with 8,000 residents and their cost of living for an apartment is $400 a month, well, we're in a different ballgame.
And that's the issue, right? But on the left, it's 15 or bust.
Yeah, it can't be 15 or bust. If you want to say 15 or bust for all major cities, cool with that.
Yeah, exactly. But you see, but that requires a certain background knowledge, right? To be able to sort of make that nuance. And a lot of the people who are demanding that this or that policy, and it's not just on the left, it's equally true, throughout the spectrum of our politics. But, we base that willingness to advocate for the position not on a knowledge we actually possess, but on a knowledge that we receive from somebody else that we have granted authority or legitimacy in our eyes. And we generally grant that authority or legitimacy on the basis of they say things that sound like what I want to hear or what I already believe. And so again, we're starting from the conclusion and then building a knowledge apparatus around that conclusion to support and defend it, which is why we end up in these ideological silos.
I don't even understand how you title our episodes because they start off on one subject and 20 minutes later they're on an entirely different concept. I would like to maybe propose anyone that's interested to study my Twitter as somebody who I try to set my mantra as eliminating my biases. I really note that in all of research and when you even pick up scientifically peer-reviewed journals, the first mistakes that you start seeing come to fruition are because people's biases and prejudices are just slipping right in. I see them make those statements of fact, and it's like, whoa, that's an opinion. And so you're not eliminating your biases and your prejudices in this. You're just looking for your claim. You're looking to prove your hypothesis right, not test your hypothesis. And these are extremely different things. And I see that on Twitter. You will see people that follow me, retweet, love everything I say until I say something like, I don't see how pardoning Joe Arpaio is a violation or breakdown of the rule of law.
Yeah.
Then a bunch of people, those same people are going to chew me out that I'm not a clear thinker, that I don't know what I'm doing. And we have to look at this within ourselves at all times, constantly ask ourselves whether we're doing this, and constantly look for other people doing it so we can try to say, hey, we have to take our emotions and prejudices and biases out of what truth is. Now, we can bend what we want to do about the truth dependent upon our morality and our opinions. So whether somebody killed somebody or not is not up for opinions. What we do with them is opinion territory, but we really got to be careful about what the differences are.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what you're describing is exactly what I mean when I say that people are essentially engaging in a theological discourse, right? And these things we say are confessional statements. So part of that confession is Joe Arpaio is this or that, and Trump's pardon of him violates the law or whatever. He's an illegitimate president, right? These are all confessional statements. They're not based on law. They're not based on legal analysis. They're based on a moral belief or some broader sort of belief you have about reality that governs which statements are accurate and not within that system. And that's what I talk about as the difference between truth and fact, right? When you say Trump is an illegitimate president, even though he was elected through a legally established process within our context, then what you're arguing is a truth, not a fact. The fact is he's a legitimate president. The truth might be in your system that he's an illegitimate president because that truth is governed by a different set of moral standards than our legal processes are.